Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Thursday evening at the museum on this fine night. Thank you for coming out. We want to tell you 2 weeks from tonight, which would be the 22nd of September, will be the history of the Star Theater. So we hope that you'll be interested. Our speaker is listed as Gary McCreary. So we're looking forward to that. I'm sure everybody here has maybe some memories of the Star Theater. And now Ron's going to handle the heavy stuff.
All right, I guess since I'm working pretty much every day the next 2 weeks on programs, Bonnie decided to let me talk about it. So coming up this weekend on Friday and Saturday from 1 until 5, we're participating in the Ohio History Connection Open Door program. So what we're going to do is have guided tours of the attic, the basement, and be able to see a couple places that aren't not open normally to the public. We may even go over and take a look in the garage if there's a little bit of a demand for that. So I've been working on preparing, for that. So that'll be another free event. And then once we get through with that, we've been working on the Wyandot County Fair. We'll be out at the log cabin again this year during the fair on the 12th through the 17th. One of our big things every year is our silent auction. And you can see on the piano on the table back there just some of the items that have been donated. We have much more than that up in the office that Sarah Fisher, my fellow curator at the Overland Inn, we've been working on. We'll probably have about 60 to 70 different gift packages to offer with a wide variety. It should be something there to interest everybody. And then we'll be out at the log cabin. As I said, we'll be out there every day. We'll have gift shop items, exhibits, a little bit of other things. And then, as Bonnie mentioned, we've got the Thursday evening program after that. So if you haven't worn yourself out at the fair that week, then that next Thursday is our next Thursday evening. And while you're out at the fair, you can get tickets for the Overland Inn dinner. The last couple of years, we've had to unfortunately cancel it. So no matter what, we're having it this year, October 1st, which is a Saturday. The first meal has like a cocktail half hour at 1, and then a meal at 1:30, and then we have another one at 5 and 5:30. So tickets will be available out at the fairgrounds or at Schuster's Flowers, or if you don't end up getting them during the fair week, Sarah Fisher will have some tickets available as well. So we hope to be able to sell out. A lot of people have been asking, so we're excited to actually offer the dinner again this year. And then we also have our annual gun raffle. So a little bit of change from in the past. Instead of an Ithaca shotgun or 2 different guns, we're offering your choice. We'll be drawing winning tickets on November 11th during our Veterans Day program. So you can have your choice. The first recipient could choose either a Kimber handgun or a $1,000 gift card to A&A Grocery. And then the second winner gets whatever wasn't chosen. So we have some tickets still available. And we have some here tonight. They're just a $20 donation. So it's a great way to support the organization. And then, as I said, we'll be drawing the winning ticket during our Veterans program in November.
And they don't have to be here today.
You don't have to be present to win, but you do have to be
And you have to buy a ticket.
Yeah, over 18 to go out and pick the gun up. You have to go out to so I think that's enough housekeeping. I could probably talk for another 20 minutes about programs that are coming up, but that's not what we're here for. We're here to learn a little bit about Russia and Ukraine with Sean Martin, who is a local lawyer, historian. I've heard a couple of his talks about Middle East and Middle Europe history, so I'm excited to hear what he has to say tonight. So without further ado, and I might add that he is our Museum Historical Society lawyer, and so he does pro bono work when we have a question about different items, or if we have issues come up. he can give us some guidance. So we appreciate that. We thank you for being here tonight and talking with us.
Thank you. Well, thanks for the invite. And if there's one thing the lawyers like to do, it's talk. So I'll try not to talk too long tonight. So I guess we'll jump right in here because Russia and Ukraine have been around for a long time. There's a lot of information to get through, and it's quite honestly, we're only going to scratch the surface. But to start out with, Russia was founded about 1,100 years ago when some Vikings went sailing down the Dnieper River, found a nice bend in the river, and decided to stay there and called it Kiev. They founded a state called the Kievan Rus. From the term Rus, we get Russia, which actually means foreigner. So kind of an interesting thing. And by that point, for centuries, the Vikings, you're probably familiar with the Vikings raiding Europe, stealing things, burning things, all looting, whatnot. But they did similar things in Eastern Europe, except they sailed up and down these great river systems, trading and also stealing and raiding, because they're Vikings, the terrors of the seas. That's what they do, or rivers in this case. So here we have a map of the Kievan Rus. It's this massive country that most people just never heard of because it didn't exist for that long, but also it was broken up into, because of how they handled inheritance in that culture, it broke up pretty quickly. But you see here, you have the heart of the country here near Kiev, expanded all the way up to Finland, all the way down to the Black Sea, huge area. And when the Vikings got there, they were pagans. Of course, at the core of Russia is Orthodoxy, Russian Orthodoxy, the Orthodox Church, and this is where Orthodoxy began. Vladimir the Great was eager to develop some trade ties with the 800-pound gorilla of the time, the Byzantine Empire. More properly, it would be the Eastern Roman Empire. And so he was eager to trade with them, eager to develop military ties, and so what's a better way to do that than to marry the emperor's sister? So that's what he did. He married the sister, Vladimir the Great, in 988, converted to Christianity, married the sister of the emperor Basil II, or Basil the Bulgar Slayer. How's that for a name? Basil the Bulgar Slayer. So at any rate, at that point, that's where the Vikings who ruled the Rus, forming Russia, became Orthodox Christians. And they also emulated the Eastern Roman manner of rule, which is a strong man and autocrat. The autocrat, firm, strong ruler. And we see that, again, comes down through Russian history. After Vladimir passes away, he has several kids, and rather than having one rule them all, it breaks up into multiple states ruled by them. Of course, they all want to be number one, so they fight each other, and they have kids and they fight each other. You get down to the grandkids, it's broken down to like 40 countries. So it didn't last, but it did create kind of this developing culture centered on the great city, Kiev. Of course, when we think of Kiev, we don't think Russia anymore because that's not where Russia is anymore. Russia moved. And so how did that happen? You can thank the Mongols. Throughout history, there have been all these nomadic steppe tribes migrated across the Russian steppe. Of course, in the 1200s, that disruptive tribe was the Mongols. Genghis Khan, all his friends. They invaded, conquered, destroyed Kiev and the country based on there. But some of the backwaters ended up not getting destroyed. They ended up just being vassals of the Mongol hordes. One of those lucky backwaters was Moscow. And so while the political and cultural centers of the Kievan Rus were destroyed, this backwater of Moscow became a grand duchy and began to grow. So from its catalyst about 1300, it grows. And you can see here, we got this little spot right here. That's the core of Russia, but it just grows and grows and grows. And they were ambitious. You have to like a country or a people that has ambition, and Russia had it in spades. Um, we're not to Ukraine yet because Ukraine doesn't really exist yet. They're going to develop later on as a separate culture, but we're not there yet. They have these Grand Dukes, but they want to be kings or something more. Again, you remember earlier I mentioned the Rus had these ties with Constantinople, with the Byzantines. Well, those are going to develop further. The Byzantine Empire was conquered in 1453. The last emperor is killed in the siege, but some of his relatives escaped, and so Rome was the capital of the Roman Empire. The second Rome was Constantinople, but it had been destroyed by the Ottomans in 1453. The Grand Duke of Moscow, Ivan III, decided, you know what? I'd like to be the third Rome. And so he marries the niece of the last Byzantine emperor. Her name was Sophia Paleologina. He marries her, starts calling himself the Tsar, and adopts many of the the autocratic court customs of the Byzantines. And from there, that's where we get the Tsar, which is Russian for Caesar. They view themselves as the third Rome, and so if you think you're the third Rome, you're going to view yourself as an emperor. You're going to view your culture as maybe superior to those around you. And you can see here that attitude is what we're seeing here, expanding throughout the hinterland and all those around them. There's a few notable characters we're going to run into. Of course, you think of Moscow; it's right in the middle of a big plain. You got a river that goes through there, but there's no oceans, there's no ports, there's not a lot there. But except for a lot of you got pretty hot summers. You have the mud season in the spring and the fall, and you have the great military tactician General Winter all winter. So you'll note one of the notable people, Peter the Great, was the Tsar in the early 1600s. He founded St. Petersburg, got them a warm water port on the Baltic. That was huge. That opened up Russia to the west and expanded it economically and culturally. And we think of Russia, they have always been, over the past 500 years, a military juggernaut, but a culturally and technologically backwards military juggernaut. You think about, of course we know that in World War II, when we think of World War II, we think of the Western Front, but in reality, 8 of 10 German casualties were on the Eastern Front. The Russians fought on the Eastern Front, we fought on the West, but if you ask the Germans where the war happened, they're going to tell you Eastern Front. Napoleon was not, we think of Napoleon, he was defeated at Waterloo, and that was his final defeat. But that's not what brought him to that point. What brought him to that point is he invaded Russia in 1812, lost his army in Russia in 1812, got defeated by a largely Russian army at the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, and he abdicated in 1814 when Tsar Alexander I marched into Paris at the head of a 100,000 strong Russian army. So again, 800-pound gorilla, lots of people, militarily powerful, but culturally backward. Because at the very same time, we've got this massive behemoth of an army walking into Paris. They have serfs. Russia was still a feudal state with serfs who were tied to the land that was owned by nobles, and these nobles could mortgage serfs. It's a really just bizarre system. It wasn't eliminated until the 1860s. Whereas the rest of Europe, they're like 300-400 years behind the rest of Europe. There's no industry to speak of at that point in time. There's completely peasants on agricultural land. And even when they have tried to industrialize late 1800s and early 1900s, so much catch up to do, they were never really able to catch up in time for World War I. Ukraine, on the other hand, the territory we now know as Ukraine, you can see here, Russia is kind of left alone. They're not conquered. They develop and expand. They're the empire eating smaller neighbors. Ukraine, on the other hand, has a very different. What we know now as Ukraine has a very different experience. In the 1200s, they're conquered by the Mongols, so they're occupied by the Mongols for a while. Then they're invaded by by the regional superpower of the 1600s, Poland. They're occupied by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and then 1700s the Russians start driving out the Poles, and again they're occupied by the Russians. But over this time, because they've had centuries of occupation by other countries and different interactions with different cultures, Poland, we have the Mongols, we have the Russians, and also in the south we have the Ottomans. You have to remember the southern part of what's now Ukraine was actually occupied by the Ottomans and the Crimean Tatars, who were another Turkish Islamic group. And so that milieu of cultural melding created an area that started to forge a unique Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian identity, and Ukrainian language that was distinct from the Russian culture that initially started on that same soil. So what we now know as Ukraine really emerged as a nation beginning in World War I. This is a map of what is now Ukraine, but you'll see different colors to show where they were at the beginning, where they started out. So this yellow area here, that's far western. The city you hear about in the area is Lviv. If you go back to the interwar period between World War I and World War II, you're going to call it Lvov. And if you go back before World War I, you're going to call it Lemberg. The reason is, before World War I, it was Austrian. After World War I, it was Polish. And after World War II, it was Soviet. Or it was part of the Ukrainian SSR, part of the Soviet Union. We can see different countries, different times these pieces of Ukraine were attached to it. Of course, so you start off, it's broken up to all these different parts. This green part was part of the Russian Empire. During World War I, they're occupied by, Ukraine is occupied by the Germans, because the same reason everyone goes to Ukraine, they need bread, they need grain to feed themselves. That's, to this day, that's what Ukraine has some of the best soil on the planet. And the Allies had blockaded Germany in World War I. They were running out of food, so they go invade Ukraine. Subsequently, they lose the war, and the next few years are very bad for Ukraine. Kiev changes hands over the next 4 years. Ukraine changes hands no less than 5 times. The worst of the Russian Civil War is fought on Ukrainian soil. Kiev, between 1917 and 1922, Kiev is occupied by the Germans. They're occupied by it's occupied by Poland. It's occupied by the Red Army. It's occupied by the White Army. The Red Army, of course, are the Russian communists. The White Army is the Russian army fighting against the Russian communists. They occupy it. There are 2 separate declared Ukrainian states who also, at various points, occupy Kiev. And at the end of this, all of this back and forth, all of this churning up of just destruction, just rampant destruction, at the end of it, they're stuck with the Soviet Communist Red Army occupying them. And it caps off in 1921 by a massive famine. Now, you've heard of the famine later on, the 30s, probably the Holodomor. But the one in 1921 was a human catastrophe as well. We have mass starvation. We have future President Herbert Hoover gets a bad rap as president, probably deservedly so. But he was one of the great figures in the world with international aid. Him and his organization essentially fed Ukraine for an entire year and bailed them out of what could have been a famine where millions of people died. The Soviets at the time under Lenin surprisingly accepted the help. They generally were not averse to having civilians die, but in this instance they allowed the world to help them to feed their people. But Ukraine, having been invaded and occupied by the Russian communists, again, beginning to view themselves as occupied, developing their own unique national identity. And that's going to become important as time goes on, because things are unfortunately going to get worse before they get better for the people of Ukraine. Um, in the early 30s, they again have some bad harvests again, but at that point in time, the land ownership has changed dramatically. In 1921, you had peasants owning and living on small farms, growing food for their own use and seeds for their own use, and so they didn't have enough, but they had something. By 1932 and 33, Stalin had implemented land redistribution plan. So they had created collectivized farms. No one had their own land, and in addition, they had quotas that the Ukrainian people had to provide in grain to the Soviet system. And if there wasn't enough grain to feed the peasant, to feed the Ukrainian people, and provide for the quotas got met first. And so Stalin was sending communist cadres out into the Ukrainian hinterland to basically take every morsel of grain the Ukrainians had. The result was approximately 4 million people died of starvation in 1932 and 1933. That would have been about 10% of the population just simply died of starvation over about a year. It's called the Holodomor, which is death by starvation. And the crazy thing about this whole process, really, just the callousness of the communist system that the Ukrainians lived under, was that during this whole time, the Soviet Union is exporting grain to sell on the international market that they've taken from the Ukrainians who are starving to death. They're going to follow that up a few years later by Stalin's Great Purge, where hundreds of thousands of more people in Ukraine and across the country, the Soviet Union, are going to be killed because they're politically inconvenient to the Soviet regime. Additionally, because Stalin was not a fan of people challenging him, or even the potential of people challenging him, there were mass deportations from Ukraine. You see down in this area, this is the Crimean Peninsula. That's been pretty important here in the past few years. But at this point in time, early 20th century, the Crimean Peninsula and the area just north of it are occupied by people called the Crimean Tatars. They're a Turkish people. They're largely Muslims. They've historically been allied with the Ottoman Empire. We've also got ethnic Ukrainians or Ruthenians here. And what Stalin did is he basically deported them from Ukraine out to Siberia, and brought in Russians to live there. Because the Soviet Union, although it was made up of various republics, the fact is it was a Russian project. The Russians led people from Russia led the thing, and were appointed. If you weren't from the Russian Socialist Republic, you weren't going to do well. So after an accidental famine, a purposeful famine, land redistribution, and a great purge, Ukraine is not happy to be part of the Soviet Union, as you might imagine. And so we see an incident, a development that to our modern eyes seems a little unusual, but I think if you view the lack of heroes, we like stories where there are heroes and villains, a good guy and a bad guy. But what happens when there are two bad guys? That's what befell Ukraine in the late 30s and 40s, in the late 30s and 1940s, because in 1941, Nazi Germany invades, and of course the Ukrainians initially welcomed the Nazi Germany as liberators. And to our mind, that seems absolutely bizarre. We know the absolute evil of Hitler and his Nazi regime, but when the Ukraine hadn't lived under that regime yet, but they had lived under Stalin. They knew the mass murderer. They knew one mass murderer, and were willing to take a gamble on the other mass murderer. And unfortunately for them, it did not pay off, because Hitler decided to be a mass murderer too, and so he executed many Ukrainians too. So you have this bizarre situation where you have Ukraine, essentially a civil war in Ukraine going on during World War II. You have a group that's working as partisans under the Nazi occupation, supporting the Soviets. Additionally, then you have others who are volunteering and to fight for the Germans because they don't want Stalin back. And this armed resistance to the Soviets actually continued even after World War II. As late as the late 50s, there was still armed resistance in Ukraine to Soviet rule. In fact, actually, the CIA was funding some of it, incidentally, but there was just a lot of misery and suffering in Ukraine. But all of this suffering helped develop a unique culture that viewed themselves as separate from Russia. But on the other hand, politically, they've been attached to Russia for so long. There's this idea there that developed of Great Russia, which is what we think of as Russia proper, and Little Russia, what we think of as Ukraine. But again, Ukraine didn't want to be Little Russia. They really wanted to be Ukraine. They're tired of being murdered by the czars. They're tired of being murdered by the communists. They just want to live. We haven't talked about this yet, but I think now is probably as good a time as any. While Ukraine suffered during the first part of the Soviet Union, in the post-war period, they became something of a kingmaker. Russia, of course, was the biggest Soviet republic, but Ukraine was the second biggest. And we're going to see a series of leaders who try to buy off Ukrainian communist leadership, starting with Nikita Khrushchev. In a situation that's going to cause trouble later on, Crimea had been part of Russia since the 1700s. It had been part of Russia. Most of it had been part of Russia since the 1700s. All of it had been part of Russia since the 1800s, since they booted out the Ottomans. In 1954, in order to curry favor with the Ukrainian Communist Party, Nikita Khrushchev transferred Crimea to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Of course, at the time, it didn't really matter too much because they're all under one government. And technically, they're separate, but in reality, they're all run from Moscow by the Politburo and whoever the strongman happens to be. Khrushchev had ties to Ukraine, so he wanted to bolster his support. Brezhnev, who would come later, also was from Ukraine and was happy to bolster his support there too. Not a big deal. We have the Sevastopol naval base there, but the Ukrainians get to be bought off a little bit. That's going to matter here later. So as the Soviet project becomes a little less murderous, though still totalitarian, it's going to wind down in some pretty big ways. Meanwhile, we have NATO. NATO is, of course, during the Cold War, we all remember, we have the Warsaw Pact and we have NATO, and each side gets their allies together in order to defend against the others. NATO, of course, initially is just Western Europe. We've got West Germany here. As the 80s grind to come to a close, the Warsaw Pact is becoming very unstable, and that's obviously good for humanity, for the Iron Curtain to be falling. Russia is economically crumbling and beginning to teeter. A deal is made to reunify Germany. The Berlin Wall comes down, and all parties agree that East Germany should become part of NATO. That's not going to be a problem, but there are assurances given that that NATO wouldn't expand east. Nothing. There are no promises, no treaties, nothing like that. But in 1990, Mikhail Gorbachev was promised that by Secretary of State James Baker. And at that point in time, the Warsaw Pact was still very much a thing. But as the Warsaw Pact starts to fall apart, some of these countries, they're sick of being ruled by the Russians, just like Ukraine is. And so they think, well, they want into NATO, and so we let them in. They become more free. Poland, Czechoslovakia, of course, Czech Republic and Slovakia, Hungary become functional democracies. They become free under the umbrella of NATO. The problem with that, though, is that Russia, because they had been their experience with the Soviet Union, viewed this as many people of the leaders have viewed this as a threat. And is an interesting thing that came up about similar in the mid-'80s. So remember, there are several near misses regarding nuclear war. Able Archer, as an example. Several of these in the early '80s where a nuclear war almost happened by accident. President Reagan was aghast at this possibility, the idea that a nuclear war could happen by accident. And once he started dealing with Gorbachev, he came to realize President Reagan was never going to launch a first strike offensive nuclear attack on the Soviet Union. He wasn't going to do that. That would be pure evil to do that. He wasn't going to do that. But as he was dealing with Gorbachev, he realized the Russians were really afraid of that. Probably wasn't justified, but they really did believe that. The Soviets really believed that, and so that was one of the realizations that really spurred him to try to work to reduce nuclear weapons. And actually, Reagan and Gorbachev actually came within a hair's breadth of eliminating all nuclear weapons between the Soviet Union and the United States, which would have been fascinating had it come to fruition. At any rate, though, that idea is still there. I think we all in this room know, NATO's they're not a threat to Russia, but there are people in the leadership who really think it is. Of course, Vladimir Putin, as we know, is playing that up for massive propaganda purposes. But at any rate, NATO has expanded east. At the same time, the USSR disintegrates. You can see this is actually a map of the Commonwealth of Independent States. So as the various Soviet republics broke off, they formed their own countries. So we have Russia here, we have Belarus, Ukraine here, and so on and so forth. But I mentioned earlier, Russia views itself. They view that Russia as a nation has viewed itself as the third Rome. They have an idea of being a great power. But at this point, in the early '90s and even today, Russia is the smallest and weakest relative to the other countries in their neighborhood that they've been in centuries. And so, with that idea in mind, the idea of NATO expanding east is more concerning than it probably ought to be. As part of this breakup, when in '91, when all these countries, the Soviet Union started breaking apart, there was real concern because many of these borders had been imposed by the Soviet Union when they were one country. Think Crimea. Crimea is a classic example. There was real concern that we would have a large number of border wars breaking out as these former Soviet republics fight with each other to conquer land. Thankfully, in '91, it didn't happen, and actually in '94, we had a real diplomatic breakthrough with the United States, the UK did a lot of really good work to broker. At the time the Soviet Union broke up, Russia and the United States were the two largest nuclear powers. Ukraine was number 3. I think a lot of people forget that the Soviet Union had a lot of weapons and manpower on Ukrainian soil at the time, and the question then was, what happens to these nuclear weapons? Well, that's where the Budapest Memorandum was arrived at in '94. Russia, the United States, and the UK all agreed that if Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons, they would be guaranteed safety and territorial integrity. That did not work out well, unfortunately, but that was the promise that was made. So we've had that situation essentially developing for 30 years now, right around 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union. We've had about 20 years of Vladimir Putin's rule in Russia, utilizing this sense of grievance and Russian nationalism in order to bolster his own power. Meanwhile, we have Ukraine here. This is before beginning of the year. You can kind of see the makeup of the country. Here we have Lviv. Here in the east, that's a major city you probably hear about in the news. Up here we have Kiev. We have Chernobyl is in this area. Kharkiv is the second biggest city. Then we have the Donbass out here, which is Donetsk and Luhansk, which have been the breakaway provinces that have been Russian-backed. And that's been Russia's modus operandi in recent years. They create Russia-backed breakaway provinces from Russia, sorry, not first. Russia backed breakaway provinces from Georgia back in the right around about 10, 15 years ago in a similar manner. They backed these unrecognized republics and then kind of help them to fight from the country they're really part of. We also had the Little Green Men in Crimea, where Russia essentially took Crimea from Ukraine. So this is how we ended up to where we're at. We have two similar cultures developed from a similar cultural framework, but not the same. They're not the same culture, they're not the same country. We have a Russia that has historically been an empire and probably wants to be an empire again. We have a new country that has only existed really an idea for about 100 years and only in fact for about 30 years. And we have a Russia that in some quarters does not really recognize Ukraine as a country. Again, Vladimir Putin has been famously saying for 15, 20 years that Ukraine isn't really a country, it's little Russia. But I think there's a lot of Ukrainians that I think would beg to differ here. So February 24th, 2022, beginning of the year, things kind of jumped off. And I think a lot of people were surprised. People I've talked to watching TV or friends and things like that, I think the general consensus was, well, Russia's going to win. It's going to be over in about a week, and Russia's going to capture Kiev, and President Zelensky's going to leave. And the United States pulled our diplomats out of the country, closed the embassy, and moved it to Poland because we thought they were going to lose. But to a lot of people's surprise, the Ukrainian people fought. They had a say in the matter, and thus far they've actually done pretty well for themselves. But there's some parts to this I think were largely overlooked. Obviously, Russia is the aggressor. Russia's much larger than Ukraine, more advanced military, larger military. And so you'd think big country loses, big country wins. But in fact, statistically speaking, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Malcolm Gladwell. He wrote a book here a few years ago called David and Goliath. And in that book, he cites a study that looked at all the conflicts between big countries and small countries over the last 200 years. And they defined that as a big country would be a country that invades a smaller country that's at least 10, where the larger country is at least 10 times larger than the smaller country. What they found is if they just fight, then the small country only wins 28.5% of the time. But you think about that, with that force differential, that's actually a lot bigger than you'd think. But if the small country fights asymmetrically, so we're talking guerrilla warfare, something like that, it completely flips. The small country actually wins 63.6% of the time. So by illustration, if the United States were to invade Canada, I think if you're a betting person, you would say United States wins. Not advocating that'd be ridiculous. But if Canada decided to fight a guerrilla war, you should bet on Canada. They're going to win. Statistically speaking, they're going to win. In this instance, Russia only has 4 times the population of Ukraine. And once mobilized, Russia only invaded with about 190,000 troops. Ukraine, once fully mustered, they've actually got more troops on the ground than Russia right now. So I think Russia. I think maybe a lot of us guessed wrong on that. The other thing is, as Americans, it's easy to look. I think as Americans, we can't help but look at things as Americans. And every country that has a military tradition has a certain ethos to that military tradition. And the United States, the one thing that we do better than anyone else is logistics. If we put troops somewhere, they're gonna have more food than they know what to do with, and they're gonna have more ammunition than they know what to do with. It goes all the way back to George Washington. George Washington, as a tactician, was not a great general. He was fair to middling, but logistics were his thing. Like, he kept them at Valley Forge. Any other general's army would have starved and disbanded, but he kept them together there. And so we've had entire nations throughout our history that have lived off of what our military has thrown away. Russia, on the other hand, the Russian military has always been this 800-pound gorilla, slow to get mobilized, not very efficient. Stuff doesn't work real well, but man, is it a huge army when it gets there, and it's hard to stop just because of sheer momentum. Well, so when you look at it in that context, what's happened makes sense. We see a line of tanks broken down on the road to Kiev for some unapparent reason. Well, maybe the equipment doesn't work real well. In the first weeks of the war, one of the questions was, how on earth is the Ukrainian Air Force still in the air? Because you look at the planes. Russia has 5th generation fighter jets, vintage, within 20 years, less than 20 years old. Ukraine has 4th generation fighter jets, circa 1980s, 70s and 80s. In theory, it shouldn't matter how bad the Russian pilots are with that type of technological advantage. Ukraine's Air Force should have been wiped off the map in 48 hours. But if we look at logistics, it might make more sense. A week into the war, Russia is telling airlines from neutral countries they're not allowed to refuel in Russia, in Moscow anymore. Korean Airlines flew planes through the Moscow airport. They're suddenly not allowed to refuel. The lack of performance makes a lot of sense if they don't have the capability to refine enough jet fuel to high enough quality or in high enough quantities to fuel their planes. If we look at World War II, we have a similar analogy there. The United States had fantastic jet fuel in World War II, but we had propeller planes. The Germans in 1944 have jet planes, the Messerschmitt 262, but they have some of the worst jet fuel on the planet. The result is they're up in the air in these jet planes, rattling and knocking all over the place, and they can't do anything. Similar dynamic in Ukraine would explain what's going on with the jets. Additionally, the United States, our doctrine with planes is air superiority. We immediately knock everyone else out of the sky, so we're controlling the skies. Russia's primary wing of their military is their army. It's army first, and so they utilize their air force in close air support, much like we would utilize our A-10 Warthog. They don't do air superiority the same way we do. So again, it makes sense why maybe the Ukrainian Air Force is still in the air. But still with that, why on earth couldn't they get to Kiev? Again, if we look at logistics and topography, we see that. There are 2 roads to Kiev. One is from Belarus. It's a 2-lane highway. It's a 2-lane highway. It goes through the Pripyat Marsh, and you're gonna get traffic jams. It's shorter, but it's not a good road. We have a highway from Russia to Kiev, but it's a longer route. You've got to cross the Dnieper River. As it turned out, Russia's faulty equipment malfunctioned both ways, and then they ended up having to withdraw because they couldn't get down the road. Yeah.
It's 2022.
Yeah, they couldn't get that. But so if we looked at the U.S. military trying to pull that off, yeah, we'd have been in Kiev in 3 days. But Russia's military is not the U.S. military, and thank goodness for that. So at the end of the day, who's going to win? I don't know. I don't think anyone knows. I think Ukraine's got a whole lot better chance than they did historically. Did look like they had it about 6 months ago, but a few possibilities. Maybe it ends in a coup. Maybe Vladimir Putin doesn't survive politically or life-wise. Maybe there's a line collapse. Many times what's happened historically in these type of stagnant military situations, one side or the other simply runs out of quality troops, runs out of materials, or runs out of nerve, and everything collapses in a quick hurry. In that instance, it could go either way. The other is negotiation, and quite honestly, that's what I'm hoping for. But at the end of the day, the real question is it going to be empire or is it going to be democracy? Right now, we have essentially a dictator, a corrupt dictatorship in Russia. But on the other hand, in Ukraine, we have a politically corrupt, one of the more corrupt political systems in the world that looks more like a democracy than a dictatorship, but it's not something we probably recognize if we are immersed in it. If both governments could lose, that might be good for the people. But at the end of the day, some sort of settled resolution is probably going to be best and stop the bloodshed. So in conclusion, I'd just like to mention something here. I had come across from the Archbishop Benjamin of San Francisco and the West. He is an Orthodox Archbishop in the Orthodox Church in America, and in March they held a prayer service for peace in Ukraine, and he said this: "The senseless violence of brother killing brother has hit home as we see Russians and Ukrainians killing each other. They are our brothers, and their conflict threatens the entire world." He went on to pray for peace and resolution. I think at the end of the day, the world will be served much better. The world and the Ukrainian people and the Russian people will be much better served by Vladimir Putin ending his war of aggression and allowing peace to return to that area of the country that's known so little peace and so little freedom over past centuries. So with that, I guess I will take questions if there are any.
Have you seen the movie Dr. Zhivago?
I have never seen Dr. Zhivago, no.
You have to see that because it talks about the industrialization of Russia, after the First World War and the building of the dams and so forth. Of course, it's this love story with beautiful music, but you might enjoy it.
Yeah, I've actually been listening to a podcast, Revolutions podcast, and they're in like episode 200 about the Russian Revolution. So it's a half-hour podcast, so you can do the math. And the industrialization of Russia after and of course Ukraine suffered from this too, where they sink massive amounts of money into heavy industry while everyone in the countryside starves. I mean, it's just such a basket case industrialization. So much human suffering.
The Budapest Memorandum.
Mm-hmm.
What's your view on that? It seems like a very toothless agreement, but they asked Ukraine for everything.
Yes.
To give up everything.
Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons. They also were given. I didn't mention this. They were given money and forgiveness of a substantial amount of debt. In the aftermath, you may remember, in the aftermath of the breakup of the Soviet Union, all of the former Soviet republics were just in dire financial straits. It's one of the few instances in the history of the world where after the fall of communism, life expectancies actually dropped. It's hard to overemphasize the economic chaos that was reigning. So I think part of it was that Ukraine really needed that debt to go away and money to help them. And the other thing is, at the time, Russia truly was flat on their back. They were so economically crippled that they weren't really a threat to Ukraine at the time. And Boris Yeltsin was their president. Boris Yeltsin was not. He was not someone you think of as a warlike, threatening figure. Putin's a little different.
Yeah. But they asked for three things, and the third thing was the one that should be protecting them to this day, and that was that they would have sovereignty.
Yes. Yep.
And we just threw up our hands. I mean, we sent them blankets in the Crimea thing during the Obama administration, but here, pretty much it's just been money, but we appear to have had our hands tied. It seems like it must have been a very poorly written memorandum at the time and agreement.
Yeah, and part of it though is in the aftermath of the breakup of the Soviet Union, we had a unipolar world for the first time in a very long time, if ever. And so I think there was some hope that the Pax Americana and this era of good feelings between between Russia and America would continue. So when I was a kid, I was in first grade when the first Gulf War broke out, and so as a kid at that point, my earliest I was somewhat of a dull child, boring child. I would watch the McNeil-Lehrer news hour when I was 4 because I wanted to see what was going on in the world. I remember watching Molotov cocktails being lobbed in 1989 in Belfast, or remember the Berlin Wall falling because I was 4 and liked the news. So anyway, but the thing is, because of my memory, my earliest memories of politics are Reagan and Gorbachev getting along well. And then I remember George H.W. Bush and Gorbachev, and then I remember watching the coup on TV, the attempted coup. So this Gulf War breaks out, and I say to my parents, it would have seemed absolutely bizarre to them, but to me it made all the sense in the world. Soviet Union and the United States are friends, right? They're helping us in the war with Iraq, and to someone whose view of things is like 2 or 3 years on, it might make sense, but anyone who lived through the early 80s and 70s, that was bonkers. Yeah. So, there is something with the what we're seeing in front of us. And in the early 90s, Putin wasn't on the horizon. It was Yeltsin was there, and things were getting less militarized, more friendly, and unfortunately that didn't continue. So.
I didn't realize Gorbachev was still living until he
Yeah.
recently
Until he
passed.
died.
Yeah.
Until he died, then I realized he
Yeah.
was still living.
Well,
I thought you were dead.
yeah, he's an interesting figure, and I think this is something that illustrates the difference between East and West perceptions. In the Western world, Gorbachev is a hero. He's a beloved elder statesman.
Yeah.
But he ran for president of Russia against Yeltsin in like '96, and he got 0.5% of the vote. He's a very unpopular figure in Russia because, Joseph Stalin is substantially more popular in Russia than Gorbachev because of this idea of the great man idea. Stalin. There are people who believe Stalin made Russia great and believe that Gorbachev burned the house down.
Yeah.
So we're going to deal with adversaries on the world stage. We need to understand they may not think how we do and try to figure out how they think about things rather than assuming they think like we do, because many times they don't.
So what happened to the weapons that the Ukraine gave up, as we say? Were they destroyed, or were they what happened to them?
Yeah, a lot of them went to Russia.
Oh,
yeah, a lot of them went to Russia. Some of them were dismantled and used for nuclear weapons. But what happened is that they gave for the most part they gave their weapons to Russia and then signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and agreed not to develop nuclear weapons. So yeah, yes.
I'd just like to say a little bit. I've been going to Ukraine for 18 years. My last visit was just last August. And what I have seen over the years, when I first started going, the roads were horrible. You talked about 2-lane roads, most of them were mud roads. And then they do have a few better roads now. But one place we were going to a village, and we actually drove through a plowed field because there was no other way in. The people, all these years, have looked at certain people and they have pointed out what they called the Russian mafia. And they could point them out going down the street. They'd see someone, they say, that's a Russian mafia, or in a car. They really did not think they were going to be invaded. They've been threatened for so many years, they did not think it would happen. When we first went, sure, the Russians had one place, there's this huge, I don't know how many acres of greenhouses that they had built to grow food. When the communists left, those greenhouses now are just there. Broken glass are not used because nobody owns them. Nobody knows what to do with it. A lot of the land that the Russians took, the communists took from the people that owned them left the country. Nobody owns that, and that land is left fallow. The people really were just getting on their feet, and this had to happen. I do keep in touch almost daily with people in Radha, BC, in the orphanage where I go, by messenger. One organization that I belong to, Sarah, collects money. We electronically can ship it or send it over. a missionary that always gets us across the border. He can go across the border, get food, bring it back. Many of the people from Kharkiv who have had to leave because of bombing are going to the orphanage, and they stay there until they are sent someplace else. And so the food that we get sent there is shipped and distributed to places that are needed. But just to tell you a little bit, there was one day on one of the Facebooks, they just got a trainload of refugees in, children. They were the ones without parents, had their names written on their hands, or had a note that had their name on it. Little kids, 6 years old, with a little bag, and that's all they had, being shipped across the country. The horror of it all. There were two little babies, newborn babies, a little boy and a little girl, twins. Their parents had been killed. One couple that we know took them because they didn't want them separated. If they were separated and shipped to different places, they might never know that they had a twin. So they kept them until they found an aunt that took them. One little boy that came into the orphanage had no arms and no legs. He had been caught up in the bombing. The horror that is there is unbelievable. And yet, they do the best they can. Just kind of let us know, they really are working hard. Everybody is trying.
One thing I do want to mention here before I conclude is, I love books. And a couple, if you're interested in learning more, there were a few books I ran across that were interesting. So one was Red Famine by Anne Applebaum. She's a journalist. Her husband is actually some sort of government, high-ranking government official in the Polish government. But she wrote a book about the Holodomor. Bloodlands is another one. It covers kind of the history between the wars in Eastern Europe and just the sheer disaster of that. But another one, it actually was interesting. So with the military side of things, I ran across this book from 1989. It was basically a hypothetical. What would it look like if Russia tried to invade through the Soviet Union tried to invade the Western powers through Central Europe in the mid-90s? And it was fascinating because all the problems that have come up in Russia were outlined in this book from over 30 years ago. The defective equipment, the lack of logistics, and actually the other thing I didn't mention earlier, in the United States we have the U.S. military. We have a very well developed system of non-commissioned officers. So if we have go into a war, we're gonna have a mixture of inexperienced troops who are with non-commissioned officers who are career soldiers. They've been in for 20 years. So maybe you've got a first or second lieutenant who's fresh out of he's pretty green, but he's going to have an NCO there to help him out. Russia has no NCOs; they never have. So you have conscripts without NCOs with lower ranking officers who also have no experience, and so that lack of an effective military organization has really come back to bite them. So and of course been to Ukraine's benefit. But the book was Red Thrust: Attack on the Central Front, Soviet Tactics and Capabilities in the 1990s. It's a 33-year-old book, but man, did it nail the Russian military capabilities. I was kind of surprised when I found it. So anyway, any other questions? All right, well, thanks a lot.